This is a Bible class about ethics. Now, when people hear something about ethics, they often get quite excited because they think, oh, great, I love talking about hard issues, controversial things, like these real delicate sort of questions about what's right and what's wrong in a certain situation, and they get kind of interested in that discussion. But I'll warn you right up front, that's not what we're doing in this Bible study. I'm not going to ask hard questions like, if you have this situation, what should you do? That's really not what I'm interested in. Because ethics is really much broader than simply questions about what do you do in a tough situation. Ethics is simply the discussion about human behavior. How are we supposed to act? How are we supposed to be? And maybe those are the two words that are best associated with ethics. How are we supposed to act? What are we supposed to do? And how are we supposed to be? What kind of people should we be? And I'm really more interested in that second part of this question about ethics. What kind of people are we supposed to be? I find that to be a really fascinating question and one that really is very important to ask, especially within the context of Christian faith. And that's where we're coming from. Because this is a Bible study, and we will get to the Bible, but I want to do a little teaching about just this whole question about human behavior. Questions like, who are we supposed to be and what are we supposed to do have been bothering people or intriguing people for a long time. The ancient Greeks considered this a critical part of any philosophical discussion. You would do things like metaphysics and you would do things like epistemology, but then you would always get to the question that mattered, really kind of the practical question that mattered the most, ethics. How are we supposed to behave based on what we've been teaching? So nowadays we have people who are doing business ethics and medical ethics and political ethics. But as Christians, we should also be very interested in ethics. How are we supposed to function in this world? The old word we would use often, not a bad word because it's old, is sanctification. Great word, really, because it means the process of being made holy, which is really kind of what ethics is all about. This whole question about how we are to behave and how we are becoming more and more holy or more like what God wants us to do. Sanctification, though, is a word that's very broad and has lots of people filling it in with all kinds of meanings, some of which is not so helpful, some which can be kind of confusing. So I'd rather maybe just kind of back off of that a little bit and just talk about ethics. How are we supposed to live? So in the old days, people would talk about ethics and they would say, well, there are two basic approaches to ethics. There is an ethics of duty, or sometimes called deontology, or there's an ethics of ends justifying the means, or an ethic of figuring out what to do in a concrete situation, which they would call utilitarian ethics. And basically, ethicists would divide between the camp of, are you a deontologist? Is there a set of rules you simply have to do? Or are you a utilitarian? Are there goals you're trying to achieve, and you figure out what's going to get you to that goal, and that's all that matters? And those two camps would kind of fight back and forth. And they would raise questions like, all right, suppose you're in this situation, what should you do? And a deontologist would say, well, what do the rules say? And a utilitarian would say, what are we trying to accomplish? And that's going to determine what we do. And some of you maybe remember a few years back, when I was quite a bit younger, one of the real popular things to do in group building, dynamic kinds of things, or group team building efforts was the scenario of, suppose you're in a situation in a lifeboat and it's overcrowded and there are too many people on board, and what are you going to do in a situation like that? And then they would start giving you the scenario of, you have this kind of person on board. You've got an old priest, and you've got a young neosurgeon, and you've got a political up-and-comer, and you've got a mother of twins, and you've got a middle-aged florist. And you only have room for 4, you've got 6 people who should stay on board. And then you would have all this big discussion that would kind of foment all this sort of stuff. Well, that's classic utilitarian kind of ethics. And even the deontologists got into that because they would start talking about duties and things we need to do. And then people get kind of confused and think, oh, that's what ethics is all about, making those kinds of hard choices. Frankly, that's really not what ethics is all about. Ethics is much more interested in simply saying, what kind of people are we supposed to do in everyday life? And that approach to ethics has an even older heritage, and it's often called virtue ethics. It's an ethics that says, what kind of people are we supposed to be? What kind of virtues are characteristic of people who are rightly ordered and rightly living? And those became issues which sort of got lost in all the hubbub of utilitarianism and deontology, but it's been revived of late. And in the late 20th century, there were several thinkers like Alistair McIntyre and Gilbert Mailander and Stanley Hauerwas who started kind of pushing this discussion back into the front and saying, it really does matter what kind of people we are. And maybe instead of trying to figure out what we should do in these hard gray area situations at the margins of life or at the tough situations where you have to figure out what would you do if this happened. Instead of asking those kinds of questions, maybe we should be saying, what is the more important thing? And the more important thing is, what kind of people are we in the day-to-day routine of life? In the Monday through Saturday routine of life, and on the Sunday routine of going to church, what kind of person are you? What kind of person are you when you talk to your kids? What kind of person are you when you are at work interacting with your workmates? Who are you as a person? And that's where virtue ethics comes into play. And that's where this key word comes in, which I'm very interested in, which is the word character. Because character is the goal of virtue ethics. Well, good character, not just any character. You've heard about people who are a character. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who are being molded into what they're supposed to be and having good character. Character, St. Paul tells us, is the result of the process of kind of being formed and shaped, and you go through perseverance, and perseverance builds character, we're told. Paul talks about this in Romans. And that's kind of what we're interested in, this idea of how character becomes part of who we are and how it shapes us. The Greeks tell us that the root of character is actually, well, in the Greek language, is to cut and inscribe and to kind of carve in. So when you're carving something, you're cutting into it. That's what character is. Character is something that is carved into us and built into us and laid down through time, and it becomes part of who we are. Character in many ways can be seen as the sum total of what makes a person a person. It's not quite the same as personality, and it's not just the same thing as your soul. Your character is the kind of person you are, who you are as an individual. The Greeks or the philosophers sometimes use the term agency. In other words, the person who is responsible, the person who is doing things. That person is doing stuff, and the way that person does things, the way they operate, the way they think, the way they are, all of that taken together becomes their character. It's been said, and I believe correctly, that you really don't know somebody's character until you can see their whole life together. You kind of back up and see the big picture, and when you see a life whole and complete, then you start to see character. Then you say, oh, that's what that person's character was like. Sometimes we get surprised when we think we know a person and we know the kind of person they are, and we think we know their character, and then it turns out, there's a surprise. It's not quite what we expected. They did something we didn't think they would do. Either maybe they were more noble than we thought, or maybe, which happens more often, they're a little more broken or a little more immoral than we had thought. And we get disappointed by that. And so character really has to be seen only in the context of an entire life. Somebody has even said that you really don't know somebody's character until that person is dead, and then you can look back and examine their whole life, then you say, that person had character. I think maybe that's true as well. So character is a big issue here. This idea of who we are as a person, the kind of person we are as we interact with others, that's what character is all about. And that's what we're interested in exploring here today and over these next few sessions together as we think about the character that God would have us to have and why character matters for us as Christian people and some of the things that play into forming and shaping character. The character matters, the things that pertain to character. So when we're thinking about character, one of the people who comes to mind, at least to me, maybe to you as well, is David. Because David, Old Testament David I'm talking about, King David, the shepherd boy, King David, the one anointed by Samuel, King David who is anointed to be king and who's got that trajectory, but then who spends a long time in the court of Saul waiting for the prophecy to be fulfilled, waiting for the promise to happen, waiting for the kingship to be given. That David, the David who goes on to write Psalms, the David who goes on to be king of Israel, the first great king. David, who is the messianic forebear, the one who has said that your reign will last forever. That David who has some problems too, but we'll get to that in a minute. The reason David comes to mind is because David is actually described in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, and also in the Old Testament, in Samuel. He's described as a man who is after God's own heart. That God himself says, David is my guy. David's my kind of man. David's the way it's supposed to be, a man after my own heart. Now, we can think about that and think, yeah, that makes sense. David wrote the Psalms. David prophesied about the coming Messiah. David was a great king. David wanted to build a temple for God, and he had his priorities right, and he did things right. But David had some problems too. And David had more than his share of shortcomings. Immediately we think about David, and you think about his Psalms and his glory, but then you think almost in the same sentence or in the same thought about, oh yeah, then there's the Bathsheba thing. There's that whole falling into temptation. There's the whole cover-up. There's the killing of her husband. All of that. Wow, that's David too. And then we begin to wonder, well, does David really have character? Or is he a terribly broken man? And I would say the answer is, yeah, he is a terribly broken man. And yeah, he does have character. God says he does. So character is more than just doing all the right stuff. Character has to do with the kind of individual you are as a human being. And I think one of the things that really sets David apart and what makes David a man after God's own heart is the very way that David acts and the way he responds when he does end up in his horrible sin. Think what happens. He covers it up and he's trying to play it like it didn't happen. But then Nathan comes and confronts him, and at that point, David actually does the hard thing. He repents. He comes clean. He admits it. And he professes his brokenness. And you can read it. More than one psalm, David talks about how when he was hiding his sin, his life was wasting away and how he was falling away, but then he repented and he turned back and God received him in grace and mercy. And I think one of the great things that sets David apart is that his whole entire life was lived rightly related to God, which is for a Christian the essence of real character. Am I living the way that God has called me to live? Am I rightly related to God, rightly related to the people around me? David exemplifies this. He had character built into him. He was practicing the character. He was being driven into God's ways and being shaped into God's ways. So his conscience was functioning the right way. We see this also earlier in David's career. And it's a story that Samuel records for us in 1 Samuel 24, a story about when David was waiting to be the new king, and Saul was still the king, and Saul had decided that David was a threat, and so David had been running and fleeing from Saul. You remember the story? He hung out in caves, he had his band of faithful men around him, and David was trying to kind of hold his own and make his way, even though Saul was the king, and Saul was not thrilled about David being out there and was actually hunting David down. Well, the story is told at one point where Saul went into a cave and David went in there too because his own men were hiding in that same cave. And the men said, David, look, God has just delivered Saul right into your hands. Go kill him. You can become king. So David creeps over, and what does he do? He cuts off a corner of Saul's garment and lets Saul go. And then later, David is bothered by this. He's bothered because he cut off the corner of Saul's garment and, in a sense, humiliated Saul, and it troubles him. And he thinks, I shouldn't have done that, which is incredible to us because we think, good grief, David, you at least didn't kill him when you had a chance. But see, David wouldn't think of harming him because Saul was put there by God. And David has to wait for God's timing. David has to wait for God to bring about his fulfillment. David won't push it. That's part of what shows character. That's when you begin to say, wow, David's a guy who's got it together. He's upright. He's waiting for God to give him the kingship. He's waiting for God to handle Saul the right way, the right time. He's not going to push it. He's not going to do that. So David then shows us an example of what character looks like. It's a man who's willing to wait on God. It's a woman who says, I'm going to do this the way God would call me to do. This is the kind of person I am. And what we're thinking about when we think about character is helping people to become the kind of people they should be, so that in any situation they find themselves, whether it's a tough end-of-life kind of gray area situation, or it's a overloaded lifeboat situation, which I doubt many of us will face, or it's a situation of having the opportunity to bring shame and humiliation to our enemy and choosing not to. Or maybe it's just the question of, how do I talk to my kids today? Or how am I going to fill out my tax form this year? Or do I drive in a responsible way today? Or how am I going to handle the gifts that God has given me in the food? Am I going to use the food rightly or abuse it? All those kinds of questions. That's where character comes into play. That's where you are the kind of person you're supposed to be. Someone has said that character is what shows up when no one is looking. And I think that's also on the right track here. Character is what you do is when you check into the hotel room for a business trip, no one's around, you have all the time to yourself, no one knows you. What are you going to do? How are you going to use that time? What kind of things are going to occupy you? Character comes into play then. Character is who you are. Character is how you operate. And that's what we're interested in thinking about. What kind of character does a Christian have? And we'll think about that as we press ahead here in this discussion, because Christians need to care about this. Maybe it seems self-evident to you, but it gets a little complicated. But we'll get into that in some future sessions. For now, I want you to think about, what is character? What's it look like? What makes for good character? How do you know good character when you see it? And what are the characteristics that we should be working for, cultivating, so that character can grow and blossom and become all that it's supposed to be? So we'll think about that more. For now, let's zero in on David and think about his character and the character that we should have and how that looks.